Cairo and Khartoum on the Arab Question, 1915 to 1918. The Arab question in British diplomacy, it is remarkable to observe, has conjured up, both among those directly involved and among subsequent commentators, an amount of passionate discussion, of anguished retrospection, of accusation and self-denunciation, quite out of proportion to its intrinsic importance. For after all, compared to the great issues of Europe, America, the Commonwealth, and India, the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration are small and paltry transactions which, as luck would have it, have turned out, it is true, to be inopportune and profitless, and the cause of much loss and tribulation. For the historian of the Middle East, of course, the British connection must loom very large by reason of its immediate impact and of its ultimate consequences. But in British history, can the short-lived Middle Eastern episode be more than a passing incident in the Indian summer of the Empire? For they are perhaps right, those who assert that had Britain been able to retain India, her Middle Eastern position could probably have been maintained, regardless of mistakes and confusions in Middle Eastern policy itself, and that India, once gone, neither virtue nor virtuosity would have been availed to preserve Suez, Haifa, and Habbaniyah. But this cool, sceptical view is rarely met in the writings either of the participants or of the subsequent commentators, whose mode is one of burning regret and vehement lamentations, and who are forever weighing good faith against bad faith, promises kept and promises broken, scrutinizing motives and examining scruples. Like the diligent followers of some strict pietism, oppression by sin, and dolefully thirsting for justification. It is curious to trace this feeling of sinfulness to its earliest origins, to see whence it could have arisen, to elucidate the now forgotten transactions which engendered it, and the confusions and ambiguities which nurtured it. On the 12th of September 1916, there was held in Cairo a conference at which were present many British high officials, including the High Commissioner, the Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, Colonel G.F. Clayton, who was then Sudan agent in Cairo and in charge of intelligence in Egypt, and Colonel C.E. Wilson, governor of the Sudan Red Sea province, then representing the British government in Jeddah. At this conference, held to consider the critical position of the Sharifan rebellion, which then seemed on the point of collapsing, Sir Henry McMahon, seeming much exercised by this difficult situation and vexed by the unhelpful and contradictory suggestions of his interlocutors, was moved to put on record how it came about that he should now be saddled with the Sharif of Mecca and his problems. It was the most unfortunate date in my life when I was left in charge of this Arab movement, he said, and I think a few words are necessary to explain that it is nothing to do with me. It is a purely military business. It began at the urgent request of Sir Ian Hamilton at Gallipoli. I was begged by the Foreign Office to take immediate action and draw the Arabs out of the war. At that moment, a large portion of the Turkish force at Gallipoli and nearly the whole of the force in Mesopotamia were Arabs, and the Germans were then spending a large amount of money in detaching the rest of the Arabs, so the situation was that the Arabs were between the two. Could we give them some guarantee of assistance in the future to justify their splitting with the Turks? I was told to do that at once, and in that way I started the Arab movement. Sir Henry McMahon's blunt and cursory account indicates the precise date at which the possibilities of Sharifian rebellion began to be taken seriously, and the military exigencies which gave rise to this new attitude. Before the autumn of 1915, British ministers did not think that a Sharifian movement would be efficient or useful in the short run, and they were afraid that in the long run, encouragement of the Sharif would be troublesome and costly. This certainly was Lord Curzon's view. In the spring and summer of 1915, Lord Cromer was plying him with suggestions emanating from Sir Reginald Wingate in Khartoum that the Sharif of Mecca be encouraged with liberal promises of future aggrandizement to secede from the Ottoman Empire and put himself at the head of a movement for Arab independence. In a letter to Cromer on the 22nd of April 1915, Curzon depreciated the idea that promises and declarations be made to the Arabs. The British, he pointed out, were not yet in Constantinople, and further, what evidence had the Arabs shown that they would be able to administer an Arab state extending from the Persian Gulf to Egypt? Again, it was not futile, he asked, to proclaim a new state, which would be without territory, capital, or ruler. Why? Lastly, should the British government prejudge the issue of the war and at once promise Basra and Baghdad to a people who are at this moment fighting against us as hard as they can and known to be in the pay of the Germans? A few months later, in reply to further talk about an Arabian caliphate, Curzon expressed great scepticism about the capacity of the Sharif. The Sharif, he agreed, was a descendant of the Prophet, but this apart, what could he accomplish? If the British government recognised him as caliph, would they not be bound to go to his support when his caliphate begins to totter or crumble? He was not greatly attracted to the perils of Oriental politics, where, as he remarked, we usually put our money on the wrong horse. Lord Curzon's views were not peculiar to himself. Official opinion at that time viewed with misgivings any plan to partition the Ottoman Empire. The Committee on Asiatic Turkey, set up in April 1915 by the Prime Minister under the chairmanship of Sir Maurice de Bunsen, regarded partition as by far the least satisfactory solution of the Eastern question. The solution which they themselves favoured was for the Ottoman Empire to remain substantially intact and its administration decentralised. That the Sharif, as a leader of an Arab Union and as Caliph, was not the wrong horse to back was emphatically the view of Sir Reginald Wingate. In a letter to Lord Stamfordham of the 5th of September 1915, he indicated what moved him to push the future Arab Union for all it was worth. Before the war, he wrote, he had supported and upheld the Turkish connection on utilitarian grounds, but when the Turks took the German side, I joined more vehemently, perhaps, than others in the hue and cry against them. Besides, he continued, I had to govern a country in which the very name of Turk stinks in the nostrils of the people. They have been ground under the heel of the Turk and Egyptian, to them the names are synonymous, and were in close proximity to the Arabs of Arabia, who entertain very similar feelings to their own in regard to their Turkish masters. For these reasons, I, who so warmly supported the Turk on utilitarian grounds, now espouse the Arab cause with still greater warmth and with more real sympathy. This sympathy and preference for the Arab over the Turk, which, as Wingate explains, came from service in the Sudan, was to leave its mark on British policy during the war and long afterwards. Indeed, Wingate's words express some of that sentimentality, so much in contrast with Curzon's scepticism, and so misplaced in politics, which was yet to colour official British attitudes until the sixth decade of the 20th century, to disappear perhaps finally only at the murder of the Hashemites and of Nouri al-Said in Baghdad on the 14th of July 1958. This sentimental bias was reinforced by arguments from policy. On the outbreak of war with the Ottoman Empire, British officials in Egypt and the Sudan had to cope with widespread Muslim hostility and to guard against its possible serious consequences on internal security and military operations. A British understanding with the Sharif, advertising a split in Muslim ranks, would bring them welcome relief and enable them to rebut Ottoman charges that Britain was waging an anti-Muslim war. Hence, they were concerned to open and maintain negotiations with the Sharif and would not want them abandoned. It followed that they had to refute any allegations tending to throw doubt on the Sharif's standing and capacity. Thus, both Wingate in Khartoum and Clayton in Cairo were ready to answer the objections to the Sharif based on the India Office, by the government of India and by others. Clayton, in the note of July 1915, declared emphatically that the Sharif possessed most of the attributes considered by Muslims essential for the caliphate and was also undoubtedly the most suitable from the British point of view. Wingate equally emphatically supported Clayton's view and added that the consensus of the Sudanese ulama was that the Sharif was in every way qualified for the caliphate. The Sharif, he said, in answer to the objections of the India Office, was not a non-entity. The India Office exaggerated the differences between Arab chieftains, and in any case, Hussein was well able to compose such differences. The urgent tone of the officials in Khartoum and Cairo is easily appreciated. Their responsibility for internal security, their proximity to the Ottoman theatre of war, made them eager to close a deal with the Sharif and impatient with the delays and objections to which they were subjected from London. There was a grave risk, they were convinced, that if their aspirations were not satisfied, the Arabs would irrevocably side with the Turks. When at the end of October 1915, negotiations with the Sharif were at last begun in earnest, Clayton wondered whether it was not already too late, but if not, it was a near thing, he thought. By the middle of the following November, when the India office were still objecting to the Sharif's demands, McMahon telephoned to warn the authorities that the matter brooked no more delay, and to reinforce his argument cited a letter from the Sharif to Syed Ali al-Maghani, the Sudanese religious dignitary, to the effect that if the British did not hasten to make an agreement, the Arabs would give their support to the Turks and the Germans. But even if we bear in mind their anxiety about Egypt and Muslim opinion, yet such haste and urgency in a case which was by no means so pressing or so dangerous as they represented, such eagerness at once to concede the patently inflated claims which the Sharif must have advanced in expectation of long and arduous bargaining, still remained surprising in cautious and experienced officials. The exigencies of the hour do not completely account for their attitude. They were already worried, certainly, about the immediate future, but they also wanted to seize the opportunity of the war to advance a scheme, which, were it to succeed, would greatly increase Great Britain's power and experience in the Middle East, would indeed make it the arbiter of the destinies of Islam in the world. A passage in a letter of March 1915 from Stores to Colonel Fitzgerald, Kitchener's military secretary, gives a hint of their hopes and ambitions. A North African or Near Eastern viceroyalty, including Egypt and Sudan, and across the way from Aden to Alexandretta, would surely, Sturs enthusiastically affirmed, compare in interest and complexity, if not in actual size, with India itself. Such a design goes far to explain their readiness to grant with little haggling or discussion what the Sharif demanded. Their views are cogently put in a letter from Wingate to Lord Hardinge, the then Viceroy of India, dated 26th of August 1915. He was, he said, increasingly drawn to a pan-Arab scheme as an antidote to the aggressive pan-Islamism of the Ottoman Empire. Pan-Arabism would bring about a balance of power in the central area of Islam. The historic position of the Arabs within Islam made them the only effective counterpoise to the Anglophobia of the Ottomans, which, he feared, would increase after the war. He had, he said, no illusions about the difficulties of his scheme, but I conceive it to be not impossible that in the dim future a federation of semi-independent Arab states might exist under European guidance and supervision, linked together by racial and linguistic bonds, owing spiritual allegiance to a single Arab primate, and looking to Great Britain as its patron and protector. Wingate was therefore expressing pious aspiration on the subject of the Sharif's idea of an Arab Union, and even of encouraging Salafis like Rashid Rida, who not only aspired to an Islamic Union in which the Arabs would have the primacy, but also desired that the political life of the Islamic State should be regulated according to the religious law. After all, he observed to Clayton a year or so later, once we decided to encourage the Sharif to act, we should have all done all we possibly could to meet his demands without demur. This I constantly urged. Instead of this, we have made 20 bites out of the cherry. With Wingate's knowledge and approval, hints on these lines were conveyed to the Sharif. Syed Ali al-Maghani, who was then being used as an intermediary in the communicating with the Sharif, employed remarkably direct and clear language. In a letter of 17th of November 1915, he urged the Sharif to restore to the Arabs the stolen caliphate and the independence and civilization which the Turks had destroyed. The Sharif was to rise and take over the Holy Arabian Qurayshite Caliphate, and there was no man better qualified. To the Sharif, who knew that his correspondent was agent and not principal, these words must have seemed to the categorical, unmistakable confirmation of the ambiguous hints which Britain official communications had earlier carried. Hussein thereafter persisted in believing that Britain promised him kingship over all the Arabs together with the Caliphate. Since official British promises of Arab independence were addressed exclusively to him, as Hogarth wrote in the paper of March 1918, the Sharif was persuaded that Arab independence necessarily meant unity under him. Since, further, the suggestion of Arab Caliphate had come, as he correctly pointed out to Colonel C.E. Wilson, not from him, but from the British, and what is more, had come quite unsolicited, it may well have appeared to Hussein that if these earlier hints were ambiguous, this was only because their authors, as non-Muslims discussing such a matter, did not think it seemly to be more explicit. When one considers the position and prospects of the British Empire as they appeared to its officials in Cairo and Khartoum, Wingate's scheme of a pan-Arab union presided over, in some fashion, by an Arab caliph, and the whole under the aegis and protection of Great Britain, a scheme which Clayton also supported, seems to be cogent and feasible. Both Wingate and Clayton advanced an attractively prudential calculation which, in their eyes, served considerably to minimise the risk of such a scheme. After all, Wingate argued in a letter to Clayton on the 15th of November 1915, "What harm can our acceptance of the Sharif's proposals do? If the embryonic Arab state comes to nothing, all our promises vanish and we are also absolved from them. If the Arab state becomes a reality, we have quite sufficient safeguards to control it, and although eventually it might act towards its allied creators as Bulgaria has acted towards Russia, I think it is in our power to erect such barriers as would effectively prevent its becoming the menace which the Indian government appears to fear." McMahon and Clayton in Cairo, for their part, were also of exactly the same mind. One particular argument which served to confirm the Cairo and Khartoum officials in their views constituted, however, a considerable misreading of the situation. In a telegram to the Foreign Office of the 3rd of December 1915, McMahon, still trying to overcome India Office objections, adduced in support of his position the idea that the Arab movement was less religious than national, and that therefore an Arab state was less dangerous to British interests than the Ottoman Empire. Some 2 months before, when Clayton had interviewed Mohammed Sharif al-Faruqi, the Ottoman officer who had deserted at Gallipoli, he had been relieved to find that the claims of the Arab nationalist societies, as represented by al-Faruqi, though similar in point of territorial extent to those of Rashid Rida and his followers, were yet devoid of Moslem fanaticism. Al-Faruqi and his fellow officers were not, Clayton reported, carried away by the dream of an Arab empire. They appeared to be reasonable men, willing to compromise and only asking for a general recognition of their aspirations by England and by the promise of a fair measure of self-government in their various countries concerned under the guidance and with the help and support of England. This beguiling contrast between Moslem fanaticism and nationalism was as wrong in theory as it was in use as practice. It is important an element of a doctrine which served, in an incalculable and far-reaching manner, to distort and falsify the calculations of policy. The belief that nationalist aspirations were benign and beneficial was, of course, no invention of Clayton's. It had become the creed of Gladstonian liberalism and applied to the British Empire, formed an essential part of liberal imperialism, so-called, which infected so many British statesmen at home and so many British officials overseas. At least from the beginning of the 20th century until the liquidation of the empire, in the Middle East itself the doctrine made attractive such policies as the support of Faisal, both in Damascus and Baghdad, Milner's policy towards Zaghloul, Allenby's declaration of the 28th of February 1922, in Egypt, supported and advocated by Clayton among others, and in the later decade, the encouragement of an Arab League. The outcome of these diverse policies is sufficient commentary on the doctrine. Al-Faruqi, Clayton reported, looked to the support of England, but of no other power. One other power was here meant, namely France, and France indeed represented then the most serious obstacle to the scheme of any Arab unity under British patronage, as mooted in Cairo and Khartoum. The officials here were aware of French claims and were indeed kept regularly informed of the Anglo-French negotiations which issued in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, and which began in London in November 1915. The records of these negotiations in the Wingate Papers are too fragmentary for a complete and coherent account, but the evidence unmistakably shows that Cairo and Khartoum views were continuously put before the Foreign Office by Sir Henry McMahon and before the War Office by General Maxwell, the GOC Egypt. Further, Wingate himself, in extensive private correspondence with Lord Stamfordham, Sir Clive Wigram, Lord Cromer, and others, endeavoured to expound and advance their views. In the War Office, Cairo and Khartoum had a valuable and zealous sympathiser, Lieutenant Colonel A.C. Parker, Kitchener's nephew, who had served in Egypt and was later to take part in the Hijaz operations and to be the civil governor of Al Arish in 1917 during Allenby's advance into Palestine. His views are set out in a note on the Arab movement, which shows him to have been a strong advocate of a descent on Alexandretta and the occupation of Aleppo, and of satisfying Arab claims by buying the French out. This idea was put to a committee composed of representatives from Foreign Office, the India Office, and the War Office, set up to concert a policy against Picot's forthcoming visit to London. Sir Arthur Nicholson, the permanent secretary at the Foreign Office, rejected the idea as impossible, and Parker reported to Clayton expressed the view that the Sharif's movement was incoherent and unreal. Indeed, the Foreign Office and the India Office were at one in their hostility to any pan-Arab scheme under British auspices. Grey agreed with Austen Chamberlain that such a scheme would be a useless and embarrassing liability and would make agreement with France impossible. Picot met the committee on the 23rd of November 1915 and declared himself sceptical of any Arab movement. He claimed for France the whole of Syria and Palestine, less the holy places, and declared that Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra should satisfy the Arabs. His move was a shrewd one, since the British were so keen on Arab support, should they not themselves make some effort to satisfy Arab claims? He, for his part, offered Mosul, which he claimed to be in the French sphere, that the British offered Baghdad and Basra. The prospect held out to him of a large-scale desertion of Arab troops from the Ottoman armies failed to tempt him, and an impasse was reached. Immediately afterwards, Parker, as he wrote to Clayton, began preparing a paper to be signed by General Caldwell, who was not, as he put it, exactly red-hot yet, for the Arab movement, which threatened dire catastrophes. Mohammedan uprisings in British possessions, withdrawal of British forces from France, etc., if the Sharif's demands were not immediately granted. These exaggerations, if they indeed met with Caldwell's approval, failed to move Picot, and we find Clayton writing to Parker on the 10th of December that if progress was to be made, Picot had to be replaced. In the event, of course, as is well known, a compromise was reached, which, in Syria, meant that the territory of the four towns of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo would constitute an Arab state under French influence. It is this latter provision that the French were to be the predominant power in the territory of the four towns, which from the beginning gave the Sykes-Picot Agreement a bad name with the officials in Cairo and Khartoum, not because it conflicted with the so-called MacMahon pledge to the Sharif or prevented or even delayed agreement with him, but rather because it meant a setback to their scheme of a Middle East entirely under British tutelage. From the very start of Anglo-Sharifian negotiations, the British side were quite aware that the Sharif's demands in respect of territory were, for the purposes of bargaining, pitched very high. He knows, wrote Storrs in the notes of 19th of August 1915, in a comment on a letter which set out the Sharif's demands, he is demanding, possibly as a basis for negotiation, far more than he has the right, the hope, or the power to expect. The ambiguities of Anglo-Sharifian diplomacy were to be the occasion in later years of much controversy, but at the time, the British officials in Cairo, made aware by the Foreign Office of possible French claims and of the need for caution, framed their proposals to the Sharif in such a manner that they could be consistent with any possible Anglo-French agreement, which at the time still remained to be negotiated, reporting on his pledge to the Sharif that the four towns of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo would form part of the Arab state. Sir Henry MacMahon stated that by adding the qualification that Great Britain could give assurances only in regard to these territories, in which she can act without detriment to the interest of her ally France, he was trying to provide for possible French claims, the extent of which he did not know. Al-Maghani's letter to the Sharif, mentioned above, for all its rhetoric, was yet careful and precatory about discussing precise territorial boundaries. In What They Told You Before, Al-Maghani wrote that the discussion of the frontier question was premature. They meant by saying this that the Arabian government had not yet come into existence and that the most important problem was first to have it brought to life and that any other question was secondary. Commenting on the course of the Anglo-French negotiations, and it would seem, before the French made their concession on Syria, Wingate wrote that even if the French demands were all conceded, the British could not be accused of a serious breach of faith with the Sharif. In a letter to Clayton the following April, Wingate reiterated that he was not a believer in a consolidated Arabian kingdom under the Sharif. Of course, he went on, any such notion is altogether remote from my real views, and it has suited me, as I believe it has suited all of us, to give the leaders of the Arab movement this impression. But impressions have to be distinguished from actual undertakings. We are quite sufficiently covered by the correspondence which has taken place to show that we are acting in good faith with the Arabs as far have gone. When agreement was finally negotiated, Clayton grudgingly admitted that there was no conflict between the two sets of undertakings. Luckily, he wrote, we have been very careful indeed to commit ourselves to nothing whatsoever, i.e. in respect of Sharifian claims. Again, Hogarth, who had intimate knowledge of the situation, writing 10 years after these events, recorded that few of us believed that the Sharif was the spokesman of one united Arab nation about to rise from the ashes of war. We do not believe, he continued, that either under him or under anyone else would it so rise united. Therefore, neither to him nor to any other Arab did we ever explicitly guarantee or even promise anything beyond liberation from the Turk. We are guiltless, therefore, he concluded, of any betrayal of King Hussein. The sole condition of his action, that he be freed from his Ottoman overlords and recognised as an independent sovereign, has been fulfilled. Furthermore, it is doubtful if the Sharif was really much interested in territorial commitments. When he replied to MacMahon's pledge, he refused, it is true, to concur in the former's conditions and qualifications, but it is highly interesting to note that his messenger reported to Stores that his son Abdullah strongly emphasised the point, obviously with the intention that his words should reach the British authorities, that the reservations contained in the written message should not be taken too seriously. The impression is strong that the Sharif, aware of his weak and isolated position in the Muslim world, and yet strongly tempted by the prospect of a caliphate, was willing, on any terms or no terms at all, to start something provided he could involve the British government in his own fortunes. Is this not the most consistent explanation of his willingness to join the British side, even when his correspondence with MacMahon showed that the tangible advantages of such a course were minimal? The weakness of his position and the temptation of the caliphate may have inclined him to disregard and dismiss for the moment the unsatisfactory and unsubstantial character of MacMahon's pledge, but he may also have been tempted into this easy opportunism by the weakness and duplicity of his servants. Towards the end of 1916, the Sharif had himself proclaimed King of the Arabs, and when the British queried the title, he replied that according to his agent in Cairo, Al-Faruqi, the High Commissioner himself had approved it. Investigation showed that Al-Faruqi, to enhance his own importance and the value of his services, had a habit of occasionally reporting to the Sharif interviews with the High Commissioner which had never taken place, and what is even more interesting, that he was apt to put into the mouth of Sir Henry things said to him by more junior people. Since the Sharif himself cancelled written messages by means of oral, it would have seemed natural to him that the British government should use his agent for messages which it did not care to send in writing. The schemes which the Sharif mooted before proclaiming his rebellion in June 1916 are sufficient indication of the drift of his policy. In February 1916, the messenger bringing a letter from the Sharif also brought a verbal message from Abdullah. Abdullah, said the messenger, wanted £3,000 for a scheme. The scheme consisted in choosing a powerful Islamic committee who would proceed to offer his father the caliphate. A little while later, the Sharif asked for Britain help to start operations in Syria. Discussing the scheme, which was turned down, Wingate allowed that it was more convenient for the Sharif to confine his operations to the Hejaz, but, he observed, it must be remembered that his desire to strengthen his position in the Syrian hinterland is intimately connected with his aspirations to the caliphate, and that these latter aspirations are at best as important an influence on his actions as the hostility to the Turks. Clayton, as has been seen, granted that between the Sykes-Picot Agreement and MacMahon's offer to the Sharif, there was no contradiction, and if he knew, as he must have, the methods and ambitions of the Sharif, he need have had little to exercise him about a breach of faith. Yet, during the negotiations in London, he expressed his disquiet and dissatisfaction at the course they were taking. In a letter of the 14th of January 1916 to Wingate, he remarked that the proposed settlement made things very difficult and that it was hard to see how we can go on negotiating much longer without laying ourselves open to a change of a breach of faith, unless we honestly tell the Arabs that we have made Syria over to the French. The ways of our government, he concluded, are truly marvellous. A few days later, he was writing that some of our Syrian friends seem to have realised that we have handed Syria over to the French and that he was expecting trouble. They should, he thought, be told so direct and advised to settle with the French. Yet when agreement was finally reached in May 1916, he was all for keeping the arrangement for the time being a secret from our Arab friends. This embarrassment over the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as at some shameful and dishonourable thing, is the first intimation of a later and widely prevalent British attitude. How to account for it in Clayton? He speaks, we may notice, of our Arab friends, of some of our Syrian friends. Can it be that his embarrassment was not so much over contradictory undertakings as over hopes, now doomed, which may have been earlier aroused among Syrian Muslims like Rashid Rida or Syrian Christians like Faris Nimir, who were either keen for the British connection per se as the latter, or wished to use it as a defence against the French ambitions like the former? Hopes which were based on what Clayton himself attempted to bring about, but there was no need for concealment, for a letter from Rashid Rida of February 1916 to Wingate's Arabic secretary tells us that the English people here say openly what France insists on the occupation of Syria or the northern part of it, and that it is quite impossible to break up with her on this account. Clayton's talk of our Arab friends and our Syrian friends brings into view another ambiguity in Anglo-Sharifian diplomacy. Formal negotiations, such as they were, had been carried on with the Sharif, but the Sharif, however, much he claimed to represent all the Arabs, had in fact no authority or standing to do so. The Sharif said a note on the Arab question, which seemed to date from the beginning of 1916, though he has always written as spokesman of the Arab nation, is not, so far as we know, supported by any organisation of Arabs nearly general enough to secure throughout, or indeed in the larger part of the Arab area, the automatic acceptance of terms agreed to by him. The Sharif, furthermore, was by no means the first on the Arab side to initiate contacts with Britain. These contacts in Cairo had been made by Syrian immigrants and their organisations, such as the Decentralisation Party, which at the outbreak of war had sent, with the knowledge of British officials, 2 agents to Syria and Mesopotamia to gather intelligence and carry out anti-Ottoman activities. The importance of these Syrians in British eyes is indicated by the fact that later on in the war, they were the recipients of an important declaration of policy, the Declaration of the Seven. Important as these men were, yet they too could hardly claim to be fully representative, so that Clayton was justified in observing that no Arab Central Committee exists in a form capable of putting forward definite proposals or appointing delegates, who could be considered representative of Arab as distinct from Sharifian views. This absence of a single authoritative body, this multiplicity of opinions and claims able to command official attention could not but darken counsel and blur the line between official undertakings and unofficial wishes, leading in the end to a maze in which were inextricably confused hints and declarations, disappointed hopes and conscientious scruples. And here may lie the explanation of Clayton's embarrassment. The progress of the war and its uncertain prospects made Clayton recur, after policy had been settled for the time being by the signature of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, to the vital importance of the Arabs. He was on a visit to London in the summer of 1916, and there, as he wrote to Wingate, made the text of any sermons which I was able to deliver at home. Do not forget that Germany would sacrifice much, indeed almost anything, to keep her hold on Turkey. Berlin to Baghdad, Basra, Persia, Afghanistan, India, is the keynote to German Weltpolitik. Granted the above, our Arab policy is one of the big cards, if not the biggest in our hand, and our main weapon against the habitual Muslim sympathy for the Turk. The next opportunity to attempt an alteration of Arab policy came in the spring of 1917, when Sykes and Picot proposed to visit Egypt and the Hejaz to display Anglo-French unity and jointly to deal on the spot with difficulties and contentions. Clayton then pointed out that the Sharif had not been officially informed of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and that, as an alternative to telling him about it, he should be told that Sykes and Picot were coming to examine the Syrian question de novo. The Foreign Office rejected the advice. One may speculate on the results of such a step. Had it been taken, official ignorance notwithstanding, the Sharif would have drawn quite interesting conclusions from this denial of the understanding between France and Britain, which he already knew to exist. Clayton knew that the Sharif was aware of the Sykes-Picot scheme and would take advantage of the absence of such official notification to pretend that the matter was not settled, and thus open the door to possible concessions. Sykes and Picot went to Jeddah, saw the Sharif, and put the agreement in his hand. The three then came to the understanding that the French position in Syria should be similar to that of the British in Mesopotamia. Clayton was quick to see the drawbacks of such an arrangement, which were indeed real enough if one assumed Anglo-French disagreement rather than agreement. Had it only been a question of the British in Baghdad, he wrote, I do not think any difficulties would have arisen, as the King probably realises that he has but little influence there, and would have been content to allow us to do pretty well as he liked. A new element has been introduced, however, by making the French position in Syria dependent on our position in Baghdad, and this is likely to make the king and the Arabs very much more attentive to what they may consider their rights and interest in Baghdad than would have ever been the case before, and I think may easily be a source of considerable embarrassment to us in Mesopotamia. Here was another bad mark against the Sykes-Picot scheme. At the time of Sykes and Picot's visit, criticism and dislike of the agreement swelled into a chorus. Colonel C.E. Wilson, the British representative in Jeddah, had been a fervent partisan of the Sharif, urging more financial help for him in August 1916. He had said he was convinced that the Sharif was the right horse to back, being probably the next caliph, and that to help him was a unique opportunity to acquire influence and control. He now sent a letter full of indignant pity for the Par Sharif, who was being asked to give his consent to things he did not understand, and of solid warning about Sykes' heavy responsibility in getting him to do so. The simple, trusting Sharif, who kept on saying that the word of Great Britain was enough for him, that he would do what Sir Mark Sykes wanted because he knew that Sykes would fight for the Arabs better than he himself could do, that he was putting the whole weight and responsibility of the future of the Arabs on Sir Mark Sykes, was also capable of asking Sykes, through Faisal his son, in exchange for the arrangement on Syria, to make Ibn Saud and the Idrisi acknowledge him as their king. Wilson records the episode, but does not seem to appreciate its comedy. If we are not going to see the Sharif through, he warned, and we let him down badly after all his trust in us, the very enviable post of pilgrimage officer at Jeddah, his ostensible office there, will be vacant because I certainly could not remain. Newcomb's voice was joined to Wilson's. Newcomb, of the military mission, had a conversation with Fouad al-Khatib on Sykes and Pico's transactions, and his generous indignation was aroused. The Sharif could not understand these complicated matters, which they debated with him, for hours were not enough for him to decide. Therefore, responsibility lay on the British government to see the Sharif or Arab cause through to the end. Otherwise, we are hoodwinking the Sharif and his people and playing a very false game in which officers attached to the Sharif's army are inevitably committed, and which I know causes anxiety in several officers' minds in case we let them down. The muddle of Anglo-Sharifan relations is again illustrated by this episode, for the same Fouad al-Khatib, whose piteous tale so moved Wilson and Newcomb, apparently also managed to convince Sir Mark Sykes that to him should go the credit of getting the Sharif to agree to the Sykes-Picot scheme. When in 1920 Rashid Rida taxed him with this behaviour, Fouad swore a heavy oath, Hil Talak, that he would now at last divulge the truth, and stated that the Sharif was in reality quite content with the Sykes-Picot scheme, that he himself attempted to oppose it by informing the British that the Sharif was against it, and that only when he found himself unable to make the Sharif oppose the scheme did he go to the British and convince them that it was really through his intercession that the Sharif came to accept the scheme. What to us seems a labyrinth of cunning and double-dealing was, however, to Wilson and Newcomb a clear and straightforward issue. The Arabs, wronged and betrayed, were exhaling their plaint by the mouth of Fouad al-Khatib, and to this plaint it was their duty chivalrously to respond. Later, it became the mark of a tender and liberal conscience to be pained at the mention of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. We here witness a first manifestation of the sentiment. The voice of conscience has always seemed quite loud in these Arab affairs. To those who invoked it, it was always audible, unambiguous, and imperious. The case of Colonel Lawrence is well known, but it is surprising to see the politic and well-informed Clayton speaking like a Wilson or a Newcomb. I cannot conscientiously, we find him declaring in the spring of 1918, carry out any line of policy which will go against our pledges to the Arabs, and I can always return to Egypt. He was at GHQ in Palestine. If they don't want me, and should in many ways prefer it, as I have no axe to grind here, as usual when conscience is invoked and we find on further inquiry that the moral and political aspects of the question are by no means so clear-cut as to call for such desperate, uncompromising manifestos. In the present case, it was Palestine and the activities of the Zionist Commission which had stirred Clayton's ire, and the ease with which he seemed to discriminate what did from what did not go against our pledges to the Arabs in this matter is very remarkable. As the war went on, objections to the Sykes-Picot Agreement were pressed again and again with the authorities in London. In the summer of 1917, D.G. Hogarth, the director of the Arab Bureau, prepared a note for them which argued the impolicy of proceeding with the agreement in the circumstances then obtaining. The agreement, Hogarth said, had favoured France to the detriment of her allies not only in the point of territory, but also because France stood to gain her share of the Ottoman Empire without being obliged to fight in the Middle East. Hogarth accepted that cogent reasons had existed for signing the agreement the year before, but he himself was inclined to think that the situation was now quite altered and that much water had run under the bridge. This, he noted, was not the view of Sir Mark Sykes and Sir Ronald Graham, who were for upholding the agreement, but he would not point out that Mesopotamia was now under British occupation, that Russia was no longer as important as she was a year before, and that democratic America had joined the war. Further, the Arabs and the Jews both wanted the British rather than the French. Therefore, while certainly not desiring entirely to exclude the French from the area and disclaiming any belief in Arab capacity for self-government, he yet wished to revise the agreement, principally so as to give Britain a stronger position both in Palestine and in Arabia proper. Wingate himself kept on pressing at that time for the amendment of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Again, in the autumn of the same year, Clayton, professing anxiety at what the Turks might offer and in order to detach the Arabs, suggested that the French government should be urgently asked to announce that they had no annexatory designs either in Syria or in the Lebanon. The Balfour Declaration, later to join the Sykes-Picot Agreement in common execration by right-thinking persons, was also invoked, and Clayton informed London that the understanding between Faisal and Weizmann would remain barren of results until the two surviving parties to the Sykes-Picot Agreement should recognise that it was no longer a practical instrument. The Cairo officials' continuing dislike of the Sykes-Picot Agreement was at last given public expression when Wingate, answering a query from the Sharif, disowned the agreement in June 1918. Justifying his action to the Foreign Office, he said that the Sharif had never been officially informed of the agreement. This, of course, was not exactly the case, since Sykes and Picot had shown it to him, and the effect of Wingate's message was stronger and ultimately more disastrous to the Sharif than if this had been really so. Concluding his telegram, Wingate asked permission to tell the Sharif without more ado that the agreement was dead for all practical purposes. Permission was refused, but in a dispatch of the following September, he could state that he was not aware to what extent the terms of the Sykes-Picot Agreement were still binding. The existence of the dispatch indicates that by the time the long-held misgivings of the Cairo officials over the Sykes-Picot Agreement had communicated themselves to the government in London, in April 1917, a committee of the Imperial War Cabinet, which included Curzon, Lord Robert Cecil, Austin Chamberlain and Smuts, and which considered British territorial desiderata at the end of the war, concluded that Palestine, which under the Sykes-Picot scheme was to be internationally administered, as well as Mesopotamia, should be under British control, as this was necessary for the safety of the empire. By the summer of 1918, private advices from London, as a contemporaneous note by Symes put it, indicated that the agreement was in abeyance and practically defunct. A specimen of such advices survives in the Wingate Papers, a letter from George Lloyd of the 10th of October 1918, in which he tells Wingate that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was dead, and that, had it not died, it would have created increasing difficulties in the future. This letter most accurately reflected the official view. In answer to a request from the Secretary of State at Washington to provide information on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, O.B. Llewellyn, counsellor at the American Embassy in London, telegraphed on the 10th of October, the very day Lloyd wrote his letter to Wingate, as follows: I ascertained from the Foreign Office that the agreement was actually made relative to spheres of influence, but that conditions have rendered it practically a dead letter. 4 days later, Lord Robert Cecil himself confirmed that statement of his officials, for, as Laughlin reported, he said that this arrangement has been rendered practically unworkable in its larger aspects by a change of conditions, particularly by our entry into the war, and that the British government now naturally wishes to consult us with respect to any such joint action in the Turkish Empire. The note by Symes gives an idea of the future policy envisaged by the Cairo officials. The Zionists and the Arabs would join in common opposition to the French, the Zionists supporting the Arabs in Syria, and the Arabs making way for the Zionists in Palestine. As for Mesopotamia, the British meant to stay there, but since open annexations were now debarred by all kinds of solemn declarations, the substance rather than the shadow of power would be secured there if the Sharif was installed as nominal ruler, and lip service was paid to the ideal of Arab unity. This was preferable to a mandate which allowed intervention by European powers. Renunciation of formal rule in Mesopotamia also meant that the British could strengthen their hands against French political penetration in Syria, and would allow Syrian prejudice, Muslim partiality, and Zionist opportunism to combine and operate on behalf of pro-British and anti-Hun influences throughout the Arab countries. In one way or another, this prescription was tried in the Middle East in the following decades. But British interests did not conspicuously benefit. Lloyd George inaugurated the series of experiments by trying, in vain, to talk the French into believing that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was no more, or perhaps had never really existed. The views and attitudes of the Cairo and Khartoum officials had an appreciable influence on the conduct of policy in 1919, but this does not exhaust their interest. The Middle Eastern question in Britain from 1919 to 1948 was by and large an affair of officials. It did not arouse any great public debate, as the Eastern question did in the 19th century, and ministers on the whole seem to have accepted and to have been guided by the views of the officials. Churchill in 1921, Austen Chamberlain in 1925-9, Parsfield in 1929, Eden and Malcolm MacDonald in 1937-9, Bevan in 45-8. The record of all these seem to give substance to such an impression, and the Cairo and Khartoum officials of the First World War seem to have been quite prominent in Middle Eastern administration and policy in the following decades. Sir Stuart Symes, who during this period was Wingate's private secretary and who was to become Chief Secretary of Palestine and Governor General of the Sudan, has a significant passage in his memoirs. It is noteworthy, he writes, how the members at different periods of Sir R. Wingate's personal staff at Khartoum was distributed subsequently in the Arabic-speaking world. Of his private secretaries, Sir Lee Stack was Governor-General of the Sudan and Serdar up to the date of his assassination in Cairo. Clayton proceeded on a special mission to Ibn Saud and was chief British representative in Iraq when he died. I followed Clayton as Chief Secretary Palestine Government of our assistant Sir Kenahan Cornwallis at this time was Chief Advisor to King Faisal and after the outbreak of war returned as British Ambassador to Baghdad. Sir A. Keown Boyd held key posts for a number of years in the Ministry of the Interior in Egypt. Each one of us, he continued, had been given his initiation into Oriental policies and the conduct of public business by the same kindly and experienced chief. When to this list are added the names of subordinates, associates, and successors, one can appreciate how a particular view of Arab policy was transmitted, upheld, defended, and publicised from decade to decade until it acquired the venerable sheen of orthodoxy. The literary Arabophiles, Colonel Lawrence and Miss Bell, cannot sustain comparison with such weighty and durable influence. They supplied the myth and the panache, but little would have been accomplished had the officials themselves not been the convinced and confident upholders of the policy. Two examples relating to officials with Sudanese connections may be given in illustration. The first concerned Sir Harold McMichael, who became High Commissioner in Palestine, and it indicates for how long heavy disapproval of the Sykes-Picot Agreement persisted. In 1939, he was host in Jerusalem to his French counterpart in the Levant, Monsieur Poe. MacMichael, according to Poe, expressed his regret over the passing out of the Near East. He did not believe in a great Arab empire, yet he nonetheless deplored the existence of frontiers which did not favour economic or cultural traffic. They were wrong to partition this region. Pual reports him as saying, "It would have been better to entrust the whole of it to one country." After an interval, he added, "To you or to us." The second concerns a man in many respects quite different from Sir Harold MacMichael, Sir Douglas Newbold, whose Sudan career culminated in the civil secretaryship. Readers of his life and letters will note with interest how fervent a supporter he was of Pan-Arabism. His simple creed was that the Zionists and the French are the real stumbling blocks in the Middle East. Can we not, on this showing, conclude that Arabophilia, whether sentimental or utilitarian, as a doctrine and a line of policy, found its main source and strength in the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan?